What we're talking about here has two applications. One is getting out of threat mode. In fact, you can talk about septal resilience networks. And the habit of reframing is the essence of that skill, you could say, that you can learn to deliberately shift from threat mode back into this purpose-driven mode. When we talk about reframing, we want people to think of the bond that they're really serving. Think of the good they want to be doing. Think of the ideal that this challenge is especially giving them a chance to practice.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at OptimalWork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at OptimalWork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the OptimalWork podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majeres. Kevin, good to be back here with you again.
Hey, Sharif, great to be back.
Yeah, Kevin. Well, this is a great part of our series on depression, which has led to, I was kind of surprised, like a total shift in OptimalWork's way of talking about things, right? I mean, I don't. Maybe you want to break the news to people, but...
Well, we had always talked about three skills of reframing, mindfulness, and challenge. But then those are, in a way, the remedies. But if you're talking about what you're fundamentally trying to get optimized, it's three engines within us. And those are meaning, effort, and attention. And so if meaning is off, it's true that reframing is a wonderful way of getting it back online. And if effort is off, more deliberate challenge gets it back online. And then if your attention is off, well, then mindfulness or sequential unitasking is a great way of getting it back online. So seeing those skills as potential remedies, but fundamentally what we're trying to do is help people in their work to have a much deeper sense of meaning that will then lead to a much more free and flexible generation of effort. And that will fuel the attention, being able to really lock in and do people's best possible work when they sit down to work.
Fantastic. And so meaning here, and so just a little bit to tell people about the plan of this episode and the next couple episodes to cover these three in more detail, each one. So first, meaning, effort, and then attention, and meaning connected to the septum as the part of the brain that we're going to be looking more into, and how it works and how it relates to the world around us and so forth. I'm interested now because we talked about reframing and meaning, and we've often talked about reframing in the context of the amygdala. So, but now we're talking about it in the context of the septum and meaning in the septum. So I don't know if you could just clarify, like, is reframing a more general skill and how it relates to the amygdala, but also the septum and what's going on there?
Yeah, so the septum has two primary modes. One is a more ventral mode and the other is more dorsal mode. At least that's right now the best indication. The reason we say that is because the ventral septum has connections to the rest of the brain that we know is used in processing bonds and these affiliative emotions. And that when a person strongly feels an emotion resonating within them, that the septum is involved in that. So in fact, the septum may be considered the seat of affective resonance. So when you feel a strong emotion. But the negative emotions, so when you feel, when you're feeling despair and fear and anger, those seem to come from the dorsal septum, which has a very direct and powerful connections to the amygdala directly. So the septum then seems to have a mode that is more purposeful and where you're doing meaningful work, and that is the part that then gives dopamine to your striatum, versus the part that's involved when you're in threat mode. So the deepest thing in us, actually, between like this kind of vitality and purpose-driven mode versus threat mode, seems to actually be in the septum itself. And so threat mode then is going to get your amygdala on high alert. So then your amygdala is ready to detect threats and respond with a surge of adrenaline and then ultimately cortisol as well. So the idea there's these two modes is really important. And probably it corresponds to a ventral dorsal distinction in the septum itself.
So it seems like there are three things going on in the septum, and I wonder if you could just clarify the relationship between them. One is bonds with other people, and then one is the affections, and we talked about, and then the other is motivation. And obviously, it's kind of clear that those things would all be related. I mean, we have affections for people, and and then that also serving people is what motivates us to do things. So I don't know if it's that simple, or if the septum is like where all those three things meet, or yeah, I don't know if you could just elaborate on that.
That's a good way of thinking of it. It's a hub where meaning and bonds and motivation all come together. So the septum receive inputs so that when a person perceives that they are being loved, particularly by someone that they have a bond with, a bond considered as some deep attachment, so that there is a kind of this habitual bond that they have with someone, and then when the person you're bonded with is expressing love or showing love or care or thoughtfulness, in the septum there is a flood of oxytocin. And the ventral septum has one of the densest amounts of oxytocin receptors in the whole brain, so that one then can actually resonate with feeling loved by the other person. Similarly, it seems that the same oxytocin is activated when you deliberately and actively love someone else. Now, actually, this is a very fascinating detail of the septum, is it does not seem to distinguish between loving and being loved. It's the same kind of activation. And so that has profound implications, I think, for loneliness. That one thing people can do is actually focus on what's in their control, try to be more loving with others. And the more loving we are towards others, in fact, the stronger the bonds develop. So that this idea that whether the septum can't really distinguish so much between being loved and loving, it more registers I'm in a bond of love with this person, at least an incipient bond of love. It's like I have this incipient friendship, and bond with this person, and I try to treat them lovingly. So the when you're thinking of the what it is like, it's yes, you have the bond and you have the resonance, the affective resonance, right? And then the last part is the motivation. The motivation is probably what we could call the main effect of septal activation, the sign that it's been fully activated. And that would be zeal. Zeal is an eagerness to do good to the one that you're bonded with. And that zeal can have two different kind of flavors. It can have one that's purely generative, trying to just do good and build the bond and serve. And zeal can also have a more when you're zealously defending someone you love, or their honor, or their reputation, or then the zeal also then is what generates the you could say like the threatening behaviors. So we know that in birds, for instance, if you block the activation of the equivalent of the septum in them, and block oxytocin from binding, that mother hens do not defend their children. And only when oxytocin is actually binding will mother hen defend the child. So it seems that oxytocin is signaling that there is a really important bond here. And then in the right context, that can trigger, the maternal behavior of taking care of the chick, or this defensive behavior of, and a mother hen can be extremely fierce, in defending their chicks. But all of that's the zeal, you could say, even at the animal level, the zeal of the septum. So the outcome of the septum of these bonds is a strong desire to in some way do good.
So, Kevin, when we think about correcting, are we looking at situations where a person's septum is kind of offline and there is a lack of motivation and maybe a coldness? Or are we looking at the situation where a person is habitually flipped into threat mode as opposed to the purpose-driven mode or purpose mode? So which are we looking at? Both? Is it even possible for a person's septum to be like habitually underactive?
I think it is. And so I think that what we're talking about here has two applications. One is getting out of threat mode. And in fact, you can talk about septal resilience networks. So you can talk about the septum being resilient and not going into threat mode. And the habit of reframing is the essence of that skill, you could say, that you can learn to deliberately shift from threat mode back into this purpose-driven mode. And so when we talk about reframing, we want people to think of the bond that they're really serving. Think of the good they want to be doing. Think of the ideal that this challenge is especially giving them a chance to practice. All of that reframing work, which doesn't happen in the septum. The reframing actually is a cortical thing. That's in the upper brain. But the effect of it reaches into the septum and helps to flip you from threat mode into this more purpose mode, this purpose-driven mode, this vitality mode, whatever we would call it. So much more common, though, is that people are not necessarily going around in threat mode all the time, but there might be a disconnect between their effort and meaning. And so they do things more rotely, more robotically. They could live much of the day in a more automated state. And that's because there's been a disconnect now from meaning. So if you want to have your highest creativity and intelligence and engagement and strategic thinking, all of that, you in fact want to tune up the septum. Because the septum has to supply through something called the VTA, the dopamine, to your ventral striatum so that you can have that way of deploying effort. So we grow the most when the septum is optimized, because that gives us this drive, this kind of zeal to do good that is the reason why we can stretch ourselves. So I think it's very common that people don't have a powerful why. So they just focus on what they're doing. So we can learn to deliberately practice activating the septum and bringing that more into it. Now, if what we're doing is involving another person, then it's especially important, because otherwise we will treat other people more robotically or more coldly. So you just imagine that someone close to you has surprised you with a very thoughtful act of kindness. And you can imagine that you just spontaneously gush with gratitude. You're like, oh, thank you so much. And you're making eye contact, you're smiling, you're nodding, and you're just so grateful for what they did. And you can say thank you from a place of very deep in your heart. So what you're feeling is septal resonance. And gratitude is a very powerful way of activating the septum. And then that shows in everything that you do. And as it's showing through your words, through your speech, the prosody and tone of the speech, as it's showing, their septum resonates as well. So you have this mutual septal resonance, this synchrony between the septa. Now, how different it would be if, let's say, you had some secret grudge against the person, you thought whatever they did was long overdue, and you're like, okay, well, finally they're doing this. And then you thank them in a more perfunctory way. Your septum isn't resonating, their septum isn't resonating, and it actually can weaken the bond. Right? So that points then to what I think is the most fundamental way of having a healthy septum, and that is the virtue of sincerity. Sincerity means that you put your heart into what you're saying. You mean what you say. So that if you say thank you or forgive me or you validate them and the other person in some way, you appreciate them in some way, or you tell them that you love them, and you mean it, that's a wonderful septal exercise to get your heart resonating with the affection as you say it. And then how would you become more sincere? Well, it would mean deliberately reflecting a little bit more on reasons to be grateful for them, on reasons to appreciate them, on the reasons to say sorry. So you would learn to have a more kind of reflective capacity. Probably also it means that you would learn when you're with them to pay more full attention to them. Because if you're like, I don't know, typing an email and hardly listening to to them, then whatever you say is going to be perfunctory. And so paying full attention to the other person and letting yourself appreciate the good qualities that they have will then make it easier to be sincere when you say these things. So I think sincerity is an underappreciated virtue. Sometimes people just think it means honesty, but I think it actually means putting your whole heart into what you say, like putting your whole being into what you say so that you're continually mobilizing the affections of the heart.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support. Well, I think that's a beautiful idea, and I also love the idea of replacing the word love with mutual septal resonance. So maybe we could just use that from now on. Very poetic. So maybe, Kevin, maybe we could go into some of these strategies, exercises that people can use to tap into this motivation, this why, this septal resonance, to kind of bring, dial things back up. And this kind of related, I think the first one that you proposed is actually an exercise on OptimalWork.com. And in the future, as we build out OptimalWork.com, these are exercises that people will be able to do more and more on the web, on the platform, website, or app.
I think eventually one of the goals for Optimal Work is that we can very quickly help people diagnose which engine is offline. Is the meaning engine offline, or the effort, or the attention? And then take the steps to get those engines working. And so the idea of here are some great exercises to optimize septal resonance, so that you can get to the point of real motivation. And the true success exercise I learned from Kirk Strassel in his book, Brief Interventions for Radical Change. So it's a wonderful book on acceptance and commitment therapy. But the basic idea is the overheard conversation. And you take as the setting whatever bond for you is the easiest to feel the resonance in. So someone that you have the best relationship with. So if it's a really important relationship, like with a spouse, and it's not too good right now, then just think of it being 10 years in the future when everything is great. So, but the setting to really see ideals is the closest bond and a healthy bond. So in that setting, then you imagine that the person doesn't know that you're home and they're talking about you on the phone to someone who's never met you. And you listen in and they're describing how wonderfully well you treat them. Then you ask yourself, what would it make me happiest to hear them say about how well I treat them? What you're looking for are what ideals seem to you to be most closely tied to this healthy bond. So it could be being caring, being thoughtful, being generous, being forgiving. Whatever those ideals are, that's what you want to write down. And then you could spend some time just free writing. Free writing is when you're just typing quickly without correcting grammar. And AI can be a wonderful companion for free writing because it can ask you questions if you pause. So you can type in things. Type in for each ideal why this matters so much to you, and are there any memories you have of living that really well, and what kind of ways in the future would you want to be living this? What you're trying to do is just to clarify the power of these ideals. And that can be a way then of unlocking the septal resonance that if you think of how to bring in one of these ideals into the work you're about to do, already then it has this relationship to bonds, at least an incipient relationship to bonds. It's just beginning, but that's okay. Ideals are perceived in the upper part of the brain, in the cortex, but they all will carry an affective resonance that then ignites the septum.
And it's great on OptimalWork.com when we take people through this exercise. The last thing we ask them to do is to come up with one specific action that would surprise the person. So it's kind of tying that back to what you mentioned earlier, that if someone did something to you that was so surprising that it elicited this sincere response from you, and then you get that virtuous cycle in the relationship, which is nice.
Yeah, and it's funny how powerful that is. I regularly, still in my practice, will ask people that question. How would you surprise them with this quality? And every single time, it really lands. It's something that it gives you permission to think about, not tit for tat sustainability. Like, oh, but if I keep doing this forever, I'll have to do it always. No, just do it once. Just really surprise them with it. And it gives people permission, in a sense, to go outside of their normal comfort zone.
Fantastic, Kevin. Well, I don't know. Do you want to just march through this list of exercises?
Yeah, I try to put together a little bit, and these ideas. And so in the first one, we're trying to use love and the ideals that will live it out, as the main way of activating the septum. The next one is gratitude. And that's another very powerful way of trying to activate it. Gratitude is sometimes the fastest way of switching out of threat mode. Just ask yourself, if I could be grateful for this opportunity, then maybe that you've been dreading some presentation you have to do, and you're like, how can I be grateful for that presentation? And so we have in the previous version of the reframer, that would be the sign of the perfect, successful reframe, is that now you can feel gratitude. So gratitude is like a seal of positivity, for the septum. So, and one way of doing that is to have either in the evening to write down at least 3 things that you're grateful for, or it could be in the morning. You could write down things you're grateful for from yesterday or about the upcoming day, things that you're grateful for. So whether it's prospective or retrospective, it's all the same. And they can be very small, just something that you enjoy and that you're so glad you can do and you can have. It could be something very big, like the current health you're enjoying or the particular relationships or job that you have. And so you want to try to savor the positive feeling of gratitude. In a way, we can learn to second the affection in the septum with our will. By rejoicing in it, by savoring it, you actually amplify it. So there's a way in which somehow then you increase the resonance just by enjoying the resonance. And gratitude is a very enjoyable resonance in the septum. Other things that people recommend, that I think can be very powerful, are writing a gratitude letter to someone. So you take someone important that you've never really thanked. You could think about writing, if you were to write a gratitude letter every day, or a gratitude email or text, and then maybe even send it to people. How different, would life be if we had, thanked the person who is taking care of the cleanliness of the gym with a little message, or by putting something on, giving them 5 stars and mentioning how well this thing is done, or, finding ways of giving people good feedback, positive feedback, showing appreciation. So a gratitude letter is the most full expression of that, whereas you try to write out how much something meant to you, and then actually send it.
Yeah, because it can we talk about the septum and its involvement in bonds with oxytocin, and it's nice to hear, when gratitude is framed in terms of an actual relationship with an actual person, and that them doing something that you're actually grateful for, as opposed to just kind of being generically grateful for something good in your life. It's when it's directed at another person, I think it's...
Yeah, to be specific about it. That's right. And then to make sure it's truly sincere. and because that shows in the smallest ways. But even it's funny, but even reading a text or email, can't you kind of tell if it's sincere or not? So it's a funny thing that we're so good at detecting sincerity. But sincerity is something we can learn to practice. We can learn to mean things. It's good that we try to dwell deliberately on gratitude, on the reasons for gratitude. Because you'll find that as gratitude increases, love increases. So if you're grateful to someone, you will love them more, and they will love you more. Gratitude in the septum involves most powerfully oxytocin, and then also the generation of dopamine, the dopamine response. And so it's profoundly motivating. And so gratitude can be a wonderful reason for them to give your best, to serve the person. So if you're, exactly. So that leads to another kind of practice, which is called the loving kindness meditation. And what that means is you try to go from intending some kind of a good for oneself to then deliberately intending it for your closest people, and then getting further and further away, and then even to difficult people, and then to the whole world. And this is one of these things, loving kindness meditation, or metta meditation, METTA, has been studied a lot and does have really profound effects. And the more people practice it, the more they feel capable of feeling a sense of love and compassion and the positive emotions. So it is a way of increasing your capacity for septal resonance. That's a funny way of putting it, but so it could be something like, may I work with joy and peace. May I meet challenges as opportunities. May I put love into every task. And you dwell on that for a bit, and you try to actually feel the intention behind those words. The meaning is not the words, it's somehow in the will behind the words. And that's the exercise here, is actually willing the good.
Mm-hmm.
But then you extend those wishes outward. And you think of some other person, and you think, okay, may he work with joy and peace. May he meet challenges as opportunities. May he put love in every task. And then you go with another one, and you go to another one. And then you get to the people who are the most difficult in your life, and you intend that to them as well. So this could be done for, 5 minutes. It could be done for 15 minutes. But you try to let your mind kind of stay with the resonance itself. And that can be a really powerful way of getting it online.
So, Kevin, this loving kindness meditation sounds very similar to spiritual practices that people of religious people would do. How can people apply this in their spiritual lives?
That's a great question, and I think that a healthy spiritual life means constant septal resonance. And that's what we want to be moving towards. And there is another practice that is, I think, potentially very spiritual, that is called the best possible self visualization. And in it, you spend, like, say, 15 minutes in a quiet space. You imagine yourself in the future, like 3 to 5 years in the future. And to think, what would your life be like if it was at its most fulfilling? I think it's a wonderful thing to imagine, like, what would your spiritual life be like? What would your relationships be like? And your work and the kind of contributions you're making. You try to think of all aspects of life. And if in 3 to 5 years, everything was really going in a wonderful way, it's very powerful to write down those kinds of things. This life that fits together, where all the elements are supporting each other, where there's vitality that's spiritual and relational and professional and in your health and everything. But I think it can be a wonderful practice for people for enabling people to set goals in these different areas. Because once you write down what it looks like when everything is working together and everything is supporting the other parts, it's easy then to look and see now where in the next week, what's one or two things I could do differently? And so it does help you to get a sense of motivation for like, now I want to really be able to do this differently. So that would be one thing that to be thinking, of the spiritual life also in your overall vision of what thriving looks like. Other things that the spiritual life allow people to, that kind of focus allows people to have is it becomes then much more possible to try to slow down and put love into little things. Because we love God, you can love anytime. So you're not limited by just the time when you're actually doing something that is very directly serving people. So it's true that if you're volunteering somewhere or in your professional setting, that very often your work is going to directly serve people and you can put more of your love into doing those acts. Spiritual life actually generalizes that because now there's a way you can put love into anything, and so each action can start to feel like a receptacle of love, something that can receive love. And you can practice putting some amount of love into very little things. So that would be a continual kind of septal resonance exercise. And then maybe there's the last thing I would say is the practice of directly stirring up affections as a form of prayer. That's called affective prayer. And it's the same ones that I kind of mentioned earlier, that you could summarize them as I love you, thank you, forgive me, help me more. And these get to the primary affections of love, gratitude, contrition, and then desire. When you are praying and you actually feel love resonating in the heart, that is the septal resonance. That can be seconded by saying these phrases, and you can time them with the inhale and the exhale. There are many forms of prayer, like the Jesus prayer or the Hail Mary, that can be said half on the inhale, half on the exhale. You try to intend the words along the lines of these four affections, not at the same time, but you can move around, and sometimes the same words can be said with different resonance, and sometimes you have to change the words. But you learn to practice meaning what you say. You take the words and you learn to milk them, and that's affective prayer is a direct exercise of sincerity. So it's learning to sincerely put your whole heart into these things, to put your whole being into these things. And it actually is, I think, the best form of optimizing the septum because it's the most direct and the most positive. And then it becomes a wonderful way of then transferring that right into your work. So we can go from affective prayer to what we could call affective work.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kevin, I think that's a great elevated but also practical note for us to end on here today because we're out of time. But we'll be back next week to talk about effort and the striatum and how the meaning and the septum helps prepare the way for that.
Wonderful.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thank you, Sharif.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out OptimalWork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.